Good morning. At the time of this taping Friday afternoon, Western leaders were engaged in intense diplomacy to persuade Russia to pull troops out of Georgia. In its biggest offensive since the end of the Cold War 17 years ago, Russia invaded Georgia a little over a week ago after the former Soviet republic tried to reassert control over one region where Moscow-backed rebels are in control. The United States quickly condemned the invasion and vowed it would oppose any attempt to strip Georgia of territory. To help us understand just what is going on and whether this is the beginning of a new Cold War between Russia and the West, we have two distinguished guests with us this morning. We'll hear from them in just a moment. Efforts are underway this weekend to bring about a ceasefire in Georgia and for Russian troops to withdraw. President Bush has sent Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to help broker a deal. Sandra Endo has more in this report.
President Bush Friday laid out a clear message for Russia. The U.S. stands by its ally Georgia. He called on Moscow to withdraw its forces and embrace a future of cooperation.
Only Russia can decide whether it will now put itself back on the path of responsible nations or continue to pursue a policy that promises only confrontation and isolation.
Diplomatic efforts are underway to resolve the conflict. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice arrived in Georgia's capital Friday to help push a final ceasefire deal. Friday, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev urged Georgia to sign the revised ceasefire agreement.
Peace needs to be reestablished in the region and guaranteed and underpinned.
There have been strong accusations from Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili.
We've received 1,400 reports of brutal attacks, slaughters, rapes, and internment of people.
Russia is disputing Georgian claims and has leveled its own accusations against the former Soviet republic. 1 week after the conflict erupted, there are disputes over just how much control Russian forces still hold over Georgian territory. The presence of Russian troops in Georgia has been a major issue in negotiating the ceasefire deal.
We're delighted to have with us in the studio today Nina Krushcheva. She is an associate professor in the graduate program of international affairs at the New School, where among other courses, she teaches Russia's contemporary politics and history. She's the author of Imagining Nabokov, Russia Between Art and Politics. Lincoln Mitchell is an assistant professor in the practice of international politics at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He is the author of the upcoming book, Uncertain Democracy, U.S. Foreign Policy, and Georgia's Rose Revolution. Thank you both for coming in. I think a lot of people, a lot of Americans are really confused about what is really going on. What touched this off? What does it mean to the United States and the other Western powers? First, let me begin by asking you, from the information that you have, is there a ceasefire in effect? One report says Georgia's president has agreed to one. Russia's president said not a done deal. What have you heard?
My sense is that there's not a ceasefire in effect yet, and there are some details that are really important in that ceasefire. The first, I think, immediately important detail is how and when do Russian troops leave Georgia? To say the Russian troops must leave Georgia is a very general statement. How that plays itself out is very important. If they stay for a few more days, do more damage, that's one thing. If they get out in a quickly and orderly fashion, that's something very different.
And Nina, what are you hearing?
I agree. There is the same problem, and I think the confusing part of this ceasefire is that the Georgians blaming the Russians for not upholding the obligations, and the Russians accusing Georgians of not completely disarming, and the reason they explain the reason why they are roaming around Georgia territory, not just the breakaway republic, but the Georgian territory per se, by the fact that they basically eliminating the possible threat. They're neutralizing the possible threat, and they insist that they should be part of the ceasefire, that no Georgian troops could actually attack Russian troops or could not attack this breakaway republic yet again.
Now, Condoleezza Rice and other diplomats are involved in trying to broker this deal, and there are some reports that one plan has been put on the table that would offer concessions to Moscow. What would those concessions be?
Well, there are concessions. The major concession is this issue about Georgia's ability to go back into South Ossetia. Georgia would say, this is a part of our country. So to take away our ability to do this is a pretty impressive concession to Moscow. There are also, I think, hidden in this, or maybe perhaps not so hidden in this, are what could be perceived as big wins for Tbilisi. One of them is that the peacekeeping forces in both South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they are going to visit the question, or revisit the question of whether or not to internationalize those peacekeeping forces. Up until now, those have been CIS, effectively Russian peacekeepers. If those become international, truly international, people from really all over the world, that's a win for Georgia.
How serious is the situation globally?
It is very serious, I believe, because since, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 years ago, we haven't had the situation when there would be such a hot discussion of a small country, and an almost military discussion of a small country between two former superpowers, of one of which remains superpower and another one insists that it has become one or is becoming one, and using this Georgian crisis as a matter of proof that it is indeed has military capacity to show its muscle.
Could we say somewhat this is like another Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, in some respects, yes. There's this small country that many people probably could have found Cuba on a map in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but many Americans certainly couldn't find Georgia on a map unless they were trying to catch a Braves game or something. So it's this very small country which suddenly explodes onto the world scene, and to just underscore how important what's going on there is, or how important Russia and the United States see it, we now have American troops on a humanitarian mission, Russian troops on a, shall we say, less than humanitarian mission in the same country. This is the first time we've had troops from these two countries on the ground in a less than friendly capacity in quite a while. That's serious. Also, there's a tremendous effect this has on Europe, and I would underscore both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, as well as some of the former republics of the Soviet Union. And so what's at stake here is the future of U.S.-Russia relations, Russia-Europe relations, and to some extent U.S. and Europe relations, because whether or not they can get on the same page in figuring out how to confront this question is also an important issue.
Now, those relations are somewhat exacerbated further this past week with Poland accepting the U.S. agreement to put in a missile defense system. Russia says the timing of this is in question. What do you make of that?
Absolutely, and Poland would argue that the reason they accepted finally the American proposal is because they're very much afraid of the Russians now. But Russia accuses the United States in being dishonest, because the United States has been saying all along that this missile shield is not against Russia, it's against Iran and other rogue countries. And what they're saying today is that indeed this particular move from Poland and the United States proved that it's all about Russia, and therefore that allows them to excuse the Georgian actions even more. And what I wanted to say a little bit, add to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is actually a very unfortunate situation, because we can't compare, but Putin is no Khrushchev, and Saakashvili, unfortunately, is no Kennedy, and therefore, in some ways, it could become even more dangerous and dramatic story.
Extremely volatile.
Absolutely.
I want to ask more about it and what the role of NATO is and where we go from here, but first we're going to take a break. We'll take a break and pick up with you when we come back. Stay with us as 11 News Close-Up continues.